Hi, and welcome to my YouTube channel. If you are new here, my name is Agla and I am watercolor artist. So in today's video, I'm gonna show you how to paint this beautiful Blackberry. So if you don't know, I make watercolor painting tutorials, and this Blackberry full few hour step-by-step tutorial is on my Patreon or right here on YouTube in memberships. So right now I'm going to show you a summary of that class, and I'll share with you the main techniques and process it took to paint it. Just to mention, to paint this Blackberry I used only 3 primary colors, so yellow, blue and red, and we mixed our own blacks. If you join my memberships or Patreon, you will be provided with material list, reference photo and line drawing. But right now, if you're interested to see how we painted it, stick around and let's get on with it. And I would like to use this opportunity to thank today's video sponsor, Miden. I have been using the products for years. This 18 well palette is my go-to for all of my tutorials, but today I'm gonna use this new one, Clean, because we're gonna be using only 3 primary colors. And this beautiful draws also from Miden, where I store my paints, but it can also be used to store pencils, brushes or whatever art materials that you use. So today I'm going to be only using, as I mentioned, 3 primaries. So I'm choosing my Miami Yellow, Sanilia Red and Phthalo Blue. Now I usually paint with my paper on a table, and that started causing my back and neck problems. So today I'm going to be painting on this table easel that you can adjust the height just the way you want it, and hopefully that will help. I love that you can take that rest away if you want to paint on a paper, and you can put it back on if you need to put a pad or canvas. I love setting up new station for brand new painting and using clean palette. So we're gonna squeeze in some of that paint now that we chose. Only 3 primaries, and I am quite confident that we can paint that Blackberry using just that and mix all of our black colors. So for this project I'm also going to be using a little bit of masking fluid, so that's what you see me using. It's a latex based medium that creates a barrier between paint and paper and protects the white of the paper for the time that you need to. And so I want to block in some of those little hairs and the brightest highlights of the Blackberry. And when I'm ready to already dry brush and put finishing touches, we're gonna remove that masking fluid, and we're gonna have that white of the paper protected to paint around or do whatever we wanted to do with it. So now we're gonna mix up our black colors. So I'm gonna be using only those 3 primaries, and just by mixing them together and slightly adjusting quantity of each, you can create sort of different hues of black. If you want more greenish, more purplish, you add more red and so on. So the only thing I would suggest is to just experiment and try and see, because it's quite easy to talk about it, but once you need to do it, it's quite a different thing. So it's best to just keep experimenting and see how it works when you try to do it yourself. So normally, as most of my paintings, I start by applying those foundation layers or under layers depending on the project. So for this one, it's gonna have an underlayer color which I can see sort of shining through that black color. So it might seem a little bit strange and weird at first, but I'm using yellow on the left side and this cool blue color on the right, and if you examine the reference quite closely, you can see the yellowish tone on one side and bluish, more purpley cool tone on the other side. So I'm laying that down first so that it would get diffused under all those black layers and shine through just subtly as we need to. It does look quite bright and perhaps scary at first, but it's a black project, so we're gonna have to apply quite a lot of layers, and all that color will get covered up and just hopefully will shine through just the right amount. When painting with watercolors, one of most important things is to practice your water control and always practice using sort of quite thin, milky watercolors, quite transparent, because when you want to layer multiple layers, you can only do it if you will always keep those layers quite transparent and light. You want that pigment to soak into the paper so that it dries and you can apply more on top. So if you pick up very thick pigment, it sort of will sit on top of the paper without soaking it in, and if you want to keep adding or work in the same area, that would become a problem because it would start lifting off that pigment. So you want to keep all pigments very light and transparent. So what I'm doing now is, after my initial underlayer, before I start applying my midtones, I want to first sort of draw myself a map. So I start painting in all the darkest parts of Blackberry, so all the black shadows and all the darkest reflections and shadows of each little bubble of that Blackberry. So that will become sort of like a map and clear a path to where is what, where is the highlight, where is the shadow. And once I've done that, then I will paint over with very light transparent colors my midtones, and hopefully those shadows will get a little bit more diffused, but also while the page is still quite light and the pencil mark is still visible, it's easier to paint in those darkest parts because they're very, as you can see, quite detailed and have various shapes. It's not just one little glaze. It kind of need to find little nooks and crannies and leave out all the highlights. So it's easier to do it now. Once I've done that, I go over one more time, intensifying, because you can see how black those blacks have to get. And it's still not going to be the last stage of getting it dark. We will dry brush and get them to really, really solid dark color, but you need to give yourself a good starting point. So 2 layers of just that, and then we can start applying our midtones. And you can see how after that the Blackberry sort of will start to tie together and look a little bit more realistic, because now it looks quite odd, doesn't it? So you can see that blue and yellow and then black shadows. So right now I'm going to start diluting all of my pigments and carefully analyze the reference and apply more yellowy black or more red and more purple where I need to. So in this step, again, very important is to have your pigments watery, very light, very transparent, even more so than before. And as you can see now, we are painting those midtones. So we're meeting the darkest parts that we just painted, the shadow parts, with this very light glaze of midtone, leaving out the highlights where appropriate. And again, this is not as dark as it's gonna have to go. It's gonna have to go a bit darker, but you want to layer those colors very gradually and not in one layer. So you want to bring those layers in, and you wanna, even the midtone that's supposedly not to be that dark, still you want a few layers of that, because then you get more vibrant and luminous color, even if you're trying to achieve a lighter color. So layers are one of the most important things in watercolor if you want it to be quite deep and luminous and realistic. So key here is to make sure we leave out all our highlights, because not everything was covered with masking fluid. So the contrast painting realistically is very important. So you do want to leave out all the light areas that's supposed to be there, because you need to create that very shiny effect. So the contrast of the darkest and lightest parts are very important. And you can see me shifting between that yellowy, black and red and purple. And once I apply that first layer, I noticed that I need more depth and I need a little bit shift to the tone. I start seeing a little bit more red pigment in the yellow side of a Blackberry, so now I'm glazing over on a second layer with this more red black, just to give that nice balance, because it was looking a little bit too yellowy. So after this step, it's safe to remove all the masking fluid, because what we're going to do now is we're going to start the dry brush process, where we're going to defining all our highlights, putting in the texture in the highlights, and painting around those little hairs that later will have to be painted with a little bit of yellow. So you can remove masking fluid with your clean finger or an eraser. And for the dry brush, you want to keep your pigments dry, so they still need to be light and transparent, but they're dry. So basically I let my pigments dry on the palette. By that time they usually are, and I loosen them up by picking up a little bit of water on my small brush, usually it's number 0, and as I pick up a little bit of pigment, I dab on a towel to take the excess. So I'm left just with this very light, not thick pigment, but it's dry. So it's just a water control, something you need to do it over and over again to get it intuitively, and that would become like a second nature. So now what we want is to intensify all our darkest parts, paint around the highlights, thin out the highlights or those little hairs. And I'm gonna dry brush from top to bottom my entire Blackberry, now focusing on the smallest area, trying to match to the reference, because we already have a very nice good base and we are very close already. So the dry brush is just what gets you to that bit that's still missing. So we intensify all of our colors, we're putting in the detail in the highlight areas, and when you dry brush with this dry pigment, you get this really dark darks. If you have too much water, you might possibly start lifting off the pigment, because when you dry brush with little brush strokes in one area, if you're doing that with too much water, you start lifting off the pigment underneath. So that's why you need to keep your pigments quite dry. So I choose the colors depending on the area that I dry brush. I either pick black or other hues of black that I have, depending on which exact area that I dry brush. Generally, when at my dry brush stage, I dry brush everything, but when you dry brush, I focus on filling in the little lighter gaps in the glaze to make the layers appear smooth. But when something is as detailed as the Blackberry, you kind of dry brush everything and you focus on the detail. So you can see when you speed it up how much that dry brush part adds and how it actually makes the painting realistic. So for me, the dry brush is one of the most important things, because I think that's the point when from sort of mediocre painting or average one, you get it to this very realistic point, if realism is what you are after, like I am. So now the dry brush is done, the Blackberry berry itself is done, and now we need to paint in those little hairs. I'm sure there is a right name for them, I don't know, so I call them hairs, but they do have a very light yellow color, so that's what I'm doing. I'm painting in with a bit of yellow and a little bit of warmer darker yellow in certain shadowy areas, and the Blackberry part itself will be finished. So all it's left is to clean up the palette, mix up a couple of greens and paint in the leaf. So leaves are quite simple. If you managed to, if you're gonna attempt to paint Blackberry, the leaves will be very easy. So I just mix up a couple of pigments, a couple of colors, one lighter, one darker, and I'm just gonna layer those colors in this quite uneven and textured fashion, because if I look closely, they look a little bit like hairy and textured. Those leaves, they're not very smooth or shiny like the berry itself is. So I'm not trying to make very nice and tidy layers. I just sort of lay my basic foundation layer on the bigger leaf with a little bit wet on wet, and the remaining leaves and stock I dry brush on dry paper with wet paint right away without applying any water. And once I apply that first initial color, I'll go back a couple more times, just adding a little bit more darkness into the areas that need it. And you can see how I'm just encouraging and intensifying the texture and not trying to make anything too smooth or perfect. And so the painting of this Blackberry is finished. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial and perhaps you will try to paint. If you would like to follow along with me, then join our Patreon community, or right here join memberships on YouTube, and you will have a full-length tutorial, reference, photo, line drawing, and full material list. So I hope you enjoyed. If you do, subscribe, like the video, and I'll see you in the future videos. Bye-bye.